Well, I took that's my title today, The Overcomer. It's really taking it right out of Fillmore. That's for the fifth Sunday in Lent, that's kind of the watchword he came up with. So it kind of has to do with identity, how we identify ourselves. So I had to come up with an identity joke. I like my jokes to be somewhat connected to my theme for the day. So you might have heard this one before. I might have used it. But good jokes are reusable. They're recyclable, don't you agree? Okay. So this is the one about the woman who had a mishap. She became ill. She had a heart attack and went into the hospital for some emergency surgery. Well, on the operating table, she had a near-death experience and actually encountered God and asked God, is this my time, God? And he said, no, my child, you have another 30 years. So she comes out of the surgery okay, and she's recovering well, so she decides while she's in the hospital, get a little work done. You know, a little lipo, a little facelift, a little tummy tuck. She even had her hairdresser come in and give her new hair color, and she left the hospital after the last operation just looking and feeling great, and I'll be darned if she didn't get hit by an ambulance right outside the hospital and die. And once again, she's face to face with God. She said, what happened, God? You said I had another 30 years. God said, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you. Mistaken identity joke. Well, the overcomer, that's the phrase Fillmore used for this Sunday in Lent. As you know, I've been kind of taking some nuggets of mystical wisdom out of Charles Fillmore's little classic, Keep a True Lent, which is, old-fashioned in some ways, but it's got some powerful little nuggets of spiritual wisdom in it. And I think this is one as well, his idea about the overcomer. As we prepare in this season of Lent for a new flow of life, a new sense of renewal and resurrection, goes right along with spring and the return of life all around us. If we want to experience a new flow of life ourselves, these are lessons in how we get there. Overcomers, are we overcomers, and how do we do that? He talks about an overcomer is one who recognizes the truth of his being, the truth of her being, who we really are, connected with God, divine beings, spiritual beings. One who recognizes the truth of his being and is renewing mind, body, and affairs by changing our thoughts from limited beliefs to divine ideas as we perceive them from our divine connection, gleaning them right from divine mind, the truth of who we are. And we're bringing new ideas into our mind in keeping with that truth of who we really are. And he says spiritual power is attained by the overcomer. No condition can hold us in bondage when we come into that spiritual power from that God connection and from becoming aware of that God connection. There's a lot of scriptures that are sort of about that idea. Scripture about overcomers, like a couple from Revelations. To everyone who overcomes, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. Or this one, to everyone who overcomes and continues to do my works to the end, I will give power over the nations. So the idea of being an overcomer is always linked to more power coming into us as we recognize who we really are. So what is that? Is this everybody? How do we come into this? How do we become overcomers? Which means us, how do we overcome any challenges in our lives, any limitations? How do we do that? Fillmore says it's kind of a two-step thing. The way of overcoming is first to place yourself by faith in the realization of your sonship or daughtership, or I kind of like the word heirship. I think I just made that one up. Being an heir. It's that God connection. That's what it's about. We recognize our son or daughtership, our heirship. That's kind of about recognizing we're made in the image of God. The Bible, or Old Testament would say, made in the image of God, which I always liked Rocco Errico's interpretation of that line. He said to say we're made in the image of God means we're a chip off the old block. A chip off the old block. That's a good way of thinking about it. We all have divinity in us. We are God connected and God linked. So it's recognizing our sonship or daughtership. And he says we start that by faith. Maybe we haven't demonstrated that yet. Maybe we've been dealing with a lot of limitations. But by faith, we realize and affirm we're sons and daughters of the living God. That's where it starts, recognizing sonship, daughtership. And then the second part is demonstrating that awareness, demonstrating it in every thought and act as faithfully as we can. Recognizing our heirship, our sonship, our daughtership, and then demonstrating it in thought and deed. That's kind of how it's done. He talks about how the perfect pattern of one who did that was demonstrated by Jesus of Nazareth, among others, down through history. And that's kind of sets the model of what we aspire to. Realizing we are that higher self. In Unity, we talk a lot about the Christ self in us. That is a way of talking about that higher self, this higher potential that exists for each of us because we're God connected. So that's the pattern, coming into recognizing our higher self and acting from that awareness. That's how we are overcomers. That's how we become them. I couldn't help but think of that this past week when I caught the news early in the week about Stephen Hawking passing on. What a grand overcomer. What a grand overcomer he was. Just amazing. He was 76. He lived more than 50 years with ALS. I don't think anyone's ever explained that, not to my satisfaction anyway. So an incredible overcomer physically, but in all kinds of other ways too. His disabilities never slowed him down. His contributions to science as a cosmologist, his awareness, I think particularly Big Bang and things like black holes, that was his big area that really changed our understanding of the universe and still is. I was interested in some of the write-ups going on online about him during the week, that he had a very bold spirit in how he lived. He lived very daringly and boldly. I thought this was interesting, some of these things he did on his 60th birthday. He celebrated by taking a hot air balloon ride. In an electric power chair with a voice synthesizer on a hot air balloon. That's pretty bold. That is pretty bold. The same week that he turned 60, he rounded a corner too quickly in his power chair and crashed and broke a leg. That was his 60th birthday. On his 65th birthday, he went up on a zero-gravity flight in a converted Boeing 727, because he was quite convinced we were going to get into interplanetary travel in the future, and he was going to be ready for it. And there's wonderful pictures of him floating around, weightless, and people kind of moving him so he doesn't crash into walls. Very daring spirit. Somebody asked him why he took so many risks, and he said, "I want to show that people need not be limited by physical handicaps as long as they are not disabled in spirit." I like that line a lot. Not disabled in spirit. He was not disabled in spirit. And though not religious, I think he was an atheist really, Stephen Hawking, he definitely had a spiritual awareness that gave him power. He was an overcomer in a grand way. So in a way it's a little hard for us to relate to, being since he was on such a grand scale, but actually we are all overcomers, and it's really everyday experience, and it's going on in our lives, in our loved ones and friends and community members' lives all the time. We just don't think of it and the power that exists in that, to be an overcomer and how that happens for each one of us. I had a friend, he passed a few years ago, but a friend for many years who was a recovering alcoholic, and he told me a story happened many years ago when he was early in his recovery process and still feeling very fragile in it and very close to not making it, very close to ruin, and going to meeting, and a woman telling him at that early meeting when he was talking to her about how uncertain and unstable he felt, and she told him with great conviction that it didn't matter what, any of those feelings, he was a survivor. He was a survivor. And it registered so strongly with him, that message, that it really impacted his sense of himself, his identity. He began to identify with a higher self, a self that was a survivor. Despite addictions, despite instability, despite problems in his life that weren't resolved yet, he began in faith to realize himself as an heir of God. He stepped into his sonship and began to think about himself in a higher light and begin to think and act and do from that. It's right out of Fillmore. And that began to change his life. And the more he did that, the more that became who he was. Because that's what happens. It's like, Fillmore calls it a law of mind. The more we identify with a higher sense of self and begin to think and act that way, the more we do that, the more we express that, the more we become that. We build it. We build it thought by thought, act by act. And that, that we can help each other in that realization. As that woman helped him, it was a significant enough encouragement that he remembered it and shared it with me 25 years later. That's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing, helping us remember who we really are. We're overcomers. There's a higher self in here that's more powerful than we realize. And it's really happening all the time. I think all addicts certainly step into recovery by coming into a more empowered sense of themselves, don't you think? Becoming aware of a higher power in them and a higher self and beginning to identify with that and think and act from that. But really in all kind of walks of life, in all situations, I stumbled upon a poet, or I think he calls himself more of a spoken word poet and performer out of Canada named Shane Coyson. I don't know whether any of you would have heard of him or his work. He's in his early 40s now. And there's a fair amount online of him presenting his spoken word pieces. He has a band that he works with that provides instrumentation while he shares his beautiful spoken word pieces, his poems. It's almost hard to define now. I think that's why a lot of people use spoken word now instead of poet and poetry, because it's sort of beyond words on a page. It's a performance. It's often music or instrumentation with it. It's very powerful. He has a very widely watched spoken word piece. I watched it on a TED Talk about being bullied as a kid and what that experience was like and how he came through that and emerged from it to become something, to become an overcomer, really, and to step into a much broader and more joyful and fuller experience of life. His spoken word piece about that is called To This Day, for the Bullied and the Beautiful. And it's a very compelling piece telling his own story. He had been a bullied child all through his growing up years. He was overweight and a lonely kid. At age 10, he was told his parents had left because they didn't want him. He was raised by grandparents. So he dealt with a lot of abandonment issues, a lot of depression. At age 12, he said he wanted to die. At 13, he wanted to kill somebody and felt himself becoming the bully that he had been subjected to so routinely. He spent more time, he said, in school, middle school, high school, trying to survive school than participating in it. And identity, he said, was sort of a limiting identity, was imposed on him. Nicknames. This is very familiar if you look back on your high school days. I found myself thinking back on them as I was watching his spoken word piece. The cruel words people will come up for people. He was called Yogi, like the bear. He was called pork chop. He was called fatty, things like that. And he made a point in his talk that it wasn't just him. There were others who were bullied in this manner. There were 3 boys especially who would lay in wait for him on his way home from school every day and, quote, made a hobby out of making him cry. A terrible bullying that he was subjected to in school. From age 15 to 18, he said he hated himself for becoming what he loathed. He was feeling himself becoming a bully until he began to write and began to identify himself in that higher way as a writer. It's just words on pages at first, but more and more, and his refuge at school became the school library, and he found friends in books that were true friends with inspiring, encouraging messages for him. At 19, the first line of poetry he ever wrote was this: "I will love myself despite the ease with which I lean toward the opposite." That's a powerful line and a powerful commitment to identifying with a higher self. I'm lovable. I am lovable. That's a higher self. That's a higher identity to claim and to affirm and to begin to express that. He was expressing it in his writing every day. It's amazing how that created a new world for him as he wrote. A lot of it taking place on the inside, not even seen on the outside for quite a while. But it became outward, as it always does. When we start to transform on the inside, it always takes outer shape then. He won up in Canada, he won a national poetry contest, I think around 2004, something like that. He presented a spoken word piece at the the Olympics in 2010. It was a piece about Canada called We Are More. And it was quite a dynamic, a huge Olympic opening ceremony at the Olympics that year. He created a band that he performs his spoken word pieces with. It's called Short Story Long. He did a TED Talk that 20 million have viewed. He has become, and I think many of the people who viewed that one, that to this day for the bullied and the beautiful, were probably a lot of them kids, trying to get through the same difficult time of having identity, a limiting identity thrust upon them, being limited by other people's labels and rejections. His guidance for bullied kids, this is the line that leaped out at me in that presentation, is this one. He said, if you can't see anything beautiful about yourself, get a better mirror. Look a little closer, stare a little longer. We need to be able to see ourselves as beautiful, as higher, as more powerful than we realize. And that's just what Fillmore was talking about. Claim that. Step into your sonship. Step into your daughtership. It doesn't have to have been demonstrated yet. We do that by faith. We claim that. We affirm that. And begin to think and act and do from it. Little by little, day by day, choice by choice, action by action, it becomes us. It becomes who we are. It seems to me isn't that the blueprint for all of us overcomers, for anybody, anywhere who's overcoming any kind of limitations? I think Fillmore's right that you start by seeing yourself differently, claiming a higher identity as not an addict, not a screw-up, not ugly, not fat, not unlovable, not unworthy, but as powerful, as having a higher self in you that is powerful and wise. There's beauty in you to be expressed, claiming that sonship, that daughtership, and expressing it more and more each day. Not perfectly, maybe not perfectly faithfully every moment of every day, but little by little, every day, expressing that in thought and deed. And as we do that, it becomes us. It becomes us. Through the Christ Spirit within, I am an overcomer. That's my affirmation for the day. Would you like to join me in it? Through the Christ Spirit within, I am an overcomer. Let's take that into prayer for a moment. Affirm that truth within. There is a higher self, a Christ Spirit within each one of us that we know. But we know who we truly are, that we are divinely connected and empowered. That there's a wisdom that flows through us, a renewing life, a steadying peace. We claim our kinship with that, our oneness with that power and presence. We let it guide us through the days ahead. We know that possibilities are unlimited. Letting God guide us, walking in the light God puts before us, letting that energy and that power flow through us in fullness. We are grateful to be one with the living God, knowing it is so. So it is. Amen.